Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson today. We're listening to The New Detectives, and this is Bite of Truth and Long Awaited Justice.
On November 6, 1989, a man driving along an isolated road in Jasper County, South Carolina, noticed something burning on the side of the road. Fearing it could spark a larger fire, he went to extinguish it. The fire was emanating from a large green duffel bag, and inside the bag the man saw what appeared to be the charred remains of a human body. He called 911. Deputies from the Jasper County Sheriff's Office raced to the scene. The person found inside the duffel bag was burned beyond recognition, and the skull had been smashed. The only clue to the victim's identity was a unicorn print nightgown that had survived the blaze, indicating this person was likely female. According to Jasper County Detective Sam Woodward, investigators found little else.
Only thing we had was a female body in a duffel bag that was set afire. Basically, that's all we had. We didn't have no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing like that.
Believing that the victim's identity would reveal her killer, police hoped an autopsy would yield valuable information. Analysis of the remains led the medical examiner to conclude that the female victim was Caucasian, around 25 years old, with dark brown hair. An enlarged uterus indicated that she had recently given birth. Her death had been brutal. She had been hit in the head 32 times with a blunt instrument. Police entered what little information they had into a national law enforcement database containing descriptions of missing persons. They also checked all local missing persons reports. But none of the reports matched the description of this Jane Doe. Authorities knew their only hope of identifying this victim was to reconstruct her face as it had been in life. For help, police called upon the expertise of Dr. Ted Rathbun, professor of anthropology at the University of South Carolina. He quickly realized this task would not be easy.
In a complete human skull, there are 22 separate bones of the skull and face. But in this instance, due to the massive trauma, there were at least 122 fragments to deal with. Some as large as the palm of your hand, others as small as half of your little fingernail. So that it really was a jigsaw puzzle, a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
After 8 days, Dr. Rathbun had successfully rebuilt the skull.
I was able to provide law enforcement and the forensic artist with a completed skull that was held together with glue, with supporting sticks and clay, so that photographs could be taken and oriented, representing an individual with a distinctive facial structure.
Forensic artist Roy Pascal of the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division was brought in. It was now up to him to bring this victim to life.
You get that high grade.
After placing rubber markers at certain points in the skull to indicate the depth of the flesh, Pascal photographed the evidence. Then he began drawing the face of the victim by hand in pencil. Four months after her body was found, Jane Doe finally had a face. Hoping to spark some recognition from the public, the victim's image was distributed 5 years went by without a break in the investigation. It began to look as if this case would never be solved. For investigators, it seemed that the identity of Jane Doe and that of her killer would remain a mystery. For nearly 5 years, a female victim found burning along a Jasper County, South Carolina road remained unidentified. Although forensic examiners had given Jane Doe a face, her name and the circumstances surrounding her death remained a mystery. Years of searching through missing persons reports failed to produce a match. And by 1993, missing persons cases filed in South Carolina had reached an all-time high. But the rash of reported cases was not limited to the civilian population. Agents from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service stationed in Charleston were also inundated with similar cases involving military personnel and members of their families. Though they had formed a cold case squad to deal with the volume, their caseload continued to increase. In October of 1993, agents responded to the home of Kathy French. Her lifelong friend, 28-year-old Annie Tahan, hadn't been heard from in nearly 5 years. At the time of her disappearance, Annie had been living with her boyfriend, Michael Palan, a sailor stationed in Charleston. And though Annie and Michael had had a child together in 1989, their relationship had been troubled. Just after Annie became pregnant, Michael grew violent and abusive toward her. He would explode into a rage for no particular reason and threaten to leave her and take their baby with him. Annie began to fear for her life, but she vowed she would never give up her child. A short while later, Kathy moved out of state. And after giving birth to her baby, Annie wanted to join her, but was reluctant because Michael Palan had had her arrested once before on bogus kidnapping charges. A few months later, Annie called her. She was ready to leave Charleston with her baby and come stay with Kathy. Kathy said she wired Annie money for bus fare, but never heard from her again. Since the father of the missing woman's child was a sailor in the United States Navy, NCIS Special Agent Jim Grievous agreed to open an investigation. But given the couple's tumultuous relationship, he had to consider that Annie's disappearance had been intentional.
We felt that maybe she was in a bad relationship with Michael Palan, and that she could have just fled. And that was a possibility we had to rule out.
A records check showed that electronics warfare chief Michael Palan was currently stationed at a naval base in Hawaii. Agent Grievous contacted agents there and asked them to speak with Palan. Michael Palan told the agents that on the morning of November 6, 1989, he woke to find that Annie had left him and the baby. He remembered that she'd called a few days later, but didn't say where she was or what her plans were. He hadn't heard from her since. Palan added that his mother, who currently lived in Savannah, Georgia, had since adopted their daughter. Naval investigators didn't believe Palan's story. For them, there was only one explanation as to why Annie Tahan was not with her baby.
We felt that if she was going to leave, what she wanted to do, she would have taken that child. That was the one thing she wanted, was to take that child with her. She did not want to lose that child. It didn't take us very long to form the opinion that she had been murdered.
Agents believed that Michael Pollan had killed Annie Tahan, but so far they had no proof. They began reviewing dozens of unsolved murder cases from throughout the state. In one of the files, dating back to 1989, Agent Grievous made a startling discovery.
That was forensic drawing of a young lady that had been found in Jasper County on November 6th of 1989. And I took this photograph I had of Annie, and I looked at both of them, and I knew right then that this was Annie, and that we had just found her.
DNA analysis confirmed that the mysterious Jane Doe was in fact Annie Tahan. And now, Naval Chief Michael Pollan was the prime suspect in her murder investigation. But NCIS Special Agent Peter Hughes knew that finding proof of his guilt would be difficult.
The problem we were confronted with was the fact that we were working a homicide case 6 years after the fact. So to start from ground zero and try and put these facts together was going to be a tremendous hurdle for all of us.
For the credit card, agents and local authorities began by trying to retrace Pollan's movements at the time of the murder.
In Hardyville.
They sifted through his phone records for November 6, 1989. They found several calls placed to a number in Savannah, Georgia, located 100 miles away. The number belonged to Pollan's ex-wife. Unsure of the connection, local police obtained her financial records. They found a receipt dated November 6th from a gas station located 25 miles from where Annie's body was discovered. Investigators began to theorize that Michael Pollan had not acted alone. Agents traveled to Miami, where Pollan's ex-wife currently lived. Though she denied any knowledge of Annie's murder, she remembered that one morning in mid-November 1989, Pollan called her. He said that Annie had recently left him, and he needed her to help take care of the baby. She agreed and drove to Pollan's apartment in Charleston a day or two later to pick up the child. But the phone records and gas receipts proved that she had traveled to the apartment on November 6th, the same day Annie was murdered. When it came to dates and times, she couldn't seem to keep her story straight. Agents confronted her with the receipts and asked if they would help refresh her memory.
Once she realized we knew she was in that apartment at about the time that Annie was murdered, she knew we had her.
Knowing she could be implicated in the murder, the ex-wife agreed to cooperate. She said that Michael Pollan didn't want Annie in his life anymore, but wanted the couple's baby. Knowing Annie would never give up her child, Pollan plotted to kill her. And the ex-wife agreed to help him pull it off. In the early morning hours of November 6th, Pollan called her and told her it was done, and he needed her help in cleaning up the apartment. When she arrived just after dawn, she noticed blood everywhere. After helping Pollan load Annie's body into the trunk of his car, she helped him shampoo the carpets and paint over the blood spatter on the walls. The information had brought agents one step closer to making their case. Now they needed to find physical proof that Michael Pollan had done what his ex-wife had accused him of. She agreed to take agents to Pollan's old apartment and walk them through the crime scene. Though the apartment was now vacant, the ex-wife was able to point out where Annie's body had been on the carpet. She also described the pattern of blood spatter on the walls and ceiling. But no blood was visible. And after so many years, agents were skeptical they would find any. Still, agents darkened the room and applied luminol throughout the area. To their surprise, blood was still present, and the locations of all the stains were exactly where the ex-wife said they would be. Though the findings had corroborated the ex-wife's statements and provided powerful evidence of Polan's guilt, agents knew it didn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was the killer.
When you look at the facts of the case, the defense attorney can easily say that this was a jealous wife who killed her. Not Polan, but a jealous wife.
Agents needed to get Michael Polan to confess to the murder. With the ex-wife's help, agents set a trap. She would phone Polan and coax him into talking about the murders.
Interesting enough, the opening comment that his ex-wife made was, Michael, they found the body. They found Annie. And his reply was, no, they didn't, which was of major significance in that an innocent person, of course, is going to say, what are you talking about? Body. I don't know what are you talking about? But now he's on the phone and he's telling us, no, the police didn't find the body.
After several days of intercepting phone calls, agents had heard enough.
Well, did you hear him deny?
3 weeks before he was scheduled to retire from the Navy, Chief Michael Polan was placed under arrest and charged with the murder of Annie Tahan. Confronted with the evidence amassed against him, Polan confessed to the crime. Determined to keep his child, he said in the early morning hours of November 6th, he returned home from work to find Annie sleeping in front of the TV. Using a blunt instrument, he beat her to death. To conceal his guilt, he placed Annie's body in a duffel bag and drove to a deserted country road. He threw gasoline on the body and lit it on fire. At a general court-martial convened at the Naval Station in Mayport, Florida, Michael Polan pled guilty to the premeditated murder of Annie Tahan. He was sentenced to 30 years at the Leavenworth Federal Prison.
As for comparisons,
Betrayal by a husband or a wife has become all too common.
this is a girl or somewhere along the way.
But military buddies claim to be loyal friends to the end.
Which are the eyes?
On the morning of April 23rd, 1998, a man pulling up weeds near an apartment complex in Newport News, Virginia, noticed something lying in the grass. When he approached, he saw that it was a human body, and the male victim had been shot to death. The man went to a nearby apartment and called 911. Officers from the Newport News Police Department responded to the scene. They began searching the victim's pockets for any clues to his identity. Inside a wallet, they found several $100s in cash and an ID card. The victim was 23-year-old Stephen November, a sailor stationed aboard an aircraft carrier at the nearby Norfolk Naval Base. He had been shot 5 times. But the lack of any stray bullets or shell casings at the scene, combined with scuff marks observed on the victim's shoes, led police to believe that Stephen November had been murdered elsewhere, then brought to this remote location. No one who lived in the area had seen or heard anything unusual. medical examiner determined that the cause of death was a 9mm gunshot wound to the victim's head. 4 other bullets, recovered from November's head and chest, appear to have been fired from the same weapon. But with few clues and no solid suspects, police knew that finding this young sailor's killer would be a difficult challenge. Police in Newport News, Virginia, continued searching for answers in the shooting death of 23-year-old Stephen November, an enlisted sailor in the United States Navy. With little physical evidence to go on, police hoped a search of his residence would yield some clues. Police scoured November's records. One document caught their attention. It was a transaction record in Stephen November's name for a 9mm handgun, the same type of gun that had been used to kill him. But a thorough search of the apartment failed to produce the weapon. Looking to uncover any information, detectives contacted the victim's commanding officers at the Norfolk Naval Base. But nothing in November's record suggested any problems. He was a dedicated sailor and was well liked by his shipmates. Hoping to retrace November's movements on the night he was murdered, detectives arranged to interview his friends and shipmates. Airman apprentice Hector Coleman said he and another friend were with November the night before his body was discovered. The 3 had gone out to run a few errands that evening. Around 10 o'clock, November asked the driver, Carlos Saldana, to drop him off at a nearby convenience store. November said he had some things to do. He would meet up with him later. He had just cashed a large tax refund check and was carrying over $2,000 in cash. The 2 men watched November enter the store and then drove away.
Cool guy.
Coleman said they never saw their friend after that. Airman recruit Carlos Saldana, who had been driving the car that night, was also interviewed. He told the same story as Hector Coleman. But almost immediately, police sensed that Saldana was not telling the truth. Newport News homicide detective Lorenzo Shepard observed the questioning.
While he was being questioned, he appeared to be very nervous. He was very fidgety. He wouldn't look you directly in the eye, and those normally are signs of individuals who are being deceptive or not being truthful when discussing something.
Detectives asked Saldana to take a polygraph test. When the results indicated deception, he decided to talk. Saldana said the 3 had gone to the convenience store that night, but they did not leave after November went inside. The victim got into the back seat of the car a few minutes later, and they drove away. He said Hector Coleman then pulled out a 9mm gun and shot Stephen November. The motive behind the murder, according to Saldana, was robbery. Saldana had no idea where the murder weapon currently was, but he knew that the gun belonged to Stephen November. Carlos Saldana and Hector Coleman were both placed under arrest and charged with murder. Coleman denied any involvement in the shooting. With Saldana's confession, police believed they had an airtight case. But a month before the case was scheduled to go to trial, An inmate serving time with Saldana in the city jail came forward with information.
I've already been here for 3 months. I don't, everybody.
Carlos Saldana had bragged that he was the one who actually murdered Stephen November. He told the inmate that he had pinned it on Hector Coleman in order to avoid the death penalty. The inmate had provided reliable information in the past, and police had no reason to doubt him now. Investigators' strongest witness had confessed to being the triggerman. And now, a month before the trial, they were back to square one. Investigators knew that one of the 2 men in custody was responsible for Stephen November's murder. But until they could prove who had pulled the trigger, they knew they could never win a conviction. Police in Newport News, Virginia, had 2 enlisted men in custody for the murder of Stephen November, a 23-year-old Navy sailor found shot to death in a vacant lot. Though Carlos Saldana told police that his friend Hector Coleman was the killer, Saldana later admitted to an inmate that he had actually pulled the trigger. With the trial just weeks away, investigators were now in danger of losing their case. But they had another option, one that would allow investigators more time to build a solid case. Newport News authorities dropped all of the charges against Hector Coleman and Carlos Saldana and turned the case over to prosecutors of the Navy's Judge Advocate General Corps, referred to as JAG, who shared jurisdiction in the investigation. JAG officer Lieutenant Commander Scott Lang took the case. And with little physical evidence, he had to prove which of the 2 witnesses was telling the truth.
The challenges in this case were that we had only 2 witnesses, and both of them had a huge motive to lie. No one wants to get pinned with being the actual trigger man in a murder. So we did not want to commit our prosecutorial efforts to any one theory based solely on the word of someone with a motive to lie.
For help, Lieutenant Commander Lang turned to special agents of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service located in Norfolk, Virginia. Agent Bill Heath was assigned the case. His first step was to determine the truthfulness of Carlos Saldana's claim that Hector Coleman committed the murder inside his vehicle.
We wanted to go back to that vehicle and determine the feasibility of Mr. Saldana's statement. Could this shooting have occurred in this vehicle as he described? That was their primary objective. Is it possible?
An initial inspection of the vehicle, however, revealed no visible traces of blood or any other signs of violence. The search of Saldana's vehicle was turning up nothing, and it seemed that agents' best chance of exposing Stephen November's killer was slipping away. But NCIS forensic examiners are trained to look past the obvious. Special Agent Mike Maloney removed the rear seat of the vehicle where Stephen November had allegedly been sitting when the murder occurred. When he split the seat cushions open, he found the underlying foam cushion soaked in blood. DNA analysis confirmed that the bloodstains had come from Stephen November's body. Using a projectile trajectory analysis, Agent Maloney now set out to prove where the shots had come from.
Projectile trajectory analysis is a method by which you take the injuries or the wounds that occur to the individual, and also any intermediate targets that the bullet may have passed through, be it the clothing, be it the seat itself, a wall, a window, and by lining those up, you're able to determine where the likely point of origin of that shot was.
A mannequin with Stephen November's bullet-ridden shirt was placed in the back seat of Saldana's car. Using the bloodstains in the seat cushion to approximate the victim's position, Agent Maloney concluded that the path of the bullets must have originated from the front passenger seat. Since Carlos Saldana was known to be the driver the night of the murder, agents could assume that Hector Coleman had occupied the front passenger seat position. But for Special Agent Heath, that was not enough. He needed to locate the murder weapon, which he believed was Stephen November's missing 9mm gun. A short while after entering the serial number into a national law enforcement database, he got a call. Police in Brooklyn, New York had arrested a man on a burglary charge, and in his possession was Stephen November's 9mm handgun.
When the gun was recovered, I was extremely happy that we had found that proverbial needle in a haystack. The next hurdle was determining, is this a murder weapon or not?
After ballistics tests confirmed that November's gun had fired the fatal shots, Agent Heath traveled to New York to find out how the gun got there. The man in custody claimed he bought the gun from a friend of his. Reluctantly, he provided agents with the name and number of the seller. Agents contacted the man who had sold the gun. Fearing for his own safety, he agreed to talk, but only in a secluded spot in a nearby park. When shown photographs of the suspects, he pointed to Hector Coleman, an old childhood friend, as the man who sold him the 9mm gun. Coleman told his friend that he had used the gun to commit a murder, and now he needed to get rid of it.
Once I was able to locate the witness in New York that actually purchased this 9mm from Mr. Coleman, his testimony became absolutely tremendous, because here we have a disinterested third party who, in a casual conversation with Mr. Coleman, was given all the details of the crime.
Though agents had no idea why Carlos Saldana had bragged to an inmate that he had pulled the trigger, they had proven that Hector Coleman had murdered Stephen November. Agents believed that before entering the convenience store, November asked his friend Hector Coleman to hold on to his 9mm gun. After driving away, Coleman said he wanted to fire the gun into the air. He asked November to make sure there were no police around. When the young sailor turned his back, Coleman shot him. He then robbed him of nearly $2,000 in tax refund money. Then had Saldana drive to a remote location where they dumped the victim. Saldana later claimed that Coleman threatened to kill him too if he told anyone about the murder. Carlos Saldana pled guilty to 1 count of accessory and 2 counts of false official statements. He was sentenced to 8 years confinement. A general court-martial was convened for Hector Coleman on August 18, 1999. He was found guilty of the robbery and murder of Stephen November. He was sentenced to life without parole in a federal prison. Violent crime poses a threat to every segment of society. But when a murder occurs within the United States Navy and Marine Corps, it falls to special agents of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service to make certain that no one escapes military justice. In Northern California, a man sacrifices everything to prove his sister's death was no accident. A sympathetic detective with a brilliant theory becomes his only ally. A young woman vanishes, and everyone's convinced she's been murdered. Texas investigators have a suspect and a motive, but absolutely no proof. At least, not yet. A sexual predator terrorizes a quiet Colorado neighborhood. When his spree suddenly ends, authorities are left with no way to find him. Anyone can get away with murder, at least for a while. But as long as a murder remains unsolved, it also remains open. justice favors the unforgotten. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. On February 22nd, 1985, Palo Alto, California police were dispatched to the home of James and Abigail Niebauer. 56-year-old James Niebauer told the officers that his wife Abby, one of Northern California's most acclaimed poets, had been accidentally shot. When officers made their way inside, they found the 47-year-old mother of three dead on the kitchen floor. She had suffered a massive shotgun blast to the chest. Police collected a partially disassembled antique shotgun lying on the floor a few feet from Abby's body. On a nearby table, police noticed polish, rags, and other cleaning supplies. Crime scene technicians photographed the scene. James Niebauer, a physical education therapist for a local public school system, explained what had happened. He said that his wife had left to run errands earlier that afternoon. James had just returned from a skiing trip with his youngest son. He worked to finish restoring an antique shotgun that he planned to give to one of his children as a gift. When Abby returned home a few hours later, he was anxious to show her the progress he had made. While she was admiring the workmanship on the barrel, the shotgun inexplicably fired. James had no idea that the old gun was loaded, nor could he explain why it fired. He couldn't believe that his wife of 27 years was gone. At autopsy, the coroner established the official cause of death as a gunshot blast to the victim's heart. Abby's death had been instantaneous. The examiner also studied the powder burns left on her blouse. Based on their size and location on the sleeves, he concluded the burn patterns were consistent with James's story. That Abby had been reaching toward the barrel when the shotgun misfired. But as news of the shooting began to spread through Palo Alto, Abby's friends came forward to police, convinced that her tragic death was anything but an accident. One close friend told police that James and Abby's 27-year marriage had turned bitter in recent years. The Niebauers, she said, had stayed together only for the sake of their three children. In fact, Abby planned to file for divorce after their youngest son left for college in a few months. Until then, Abby hoped to minimize the tensions in the house by converting the couple's garage into her own apartment. But James refused to let go. He would often explode into a rage, accusing Abby of seeing other men. Abby began to fear for her own safety. Despite James Niebauer's story to the contrary, friends were convinced that Abby would never have approached him as he held a weapon. Forensic technicians examined the old shotgun. After a thorough analysis, they could find no obvious flaws in the trigger mechanism that would explain why the shotgun had spontaneously fired. Nevertheless, when police reviewed all of the facts of the case, they concluded that Abby's death was consistent with an accidental shooting. The shotgun and Abby Niebauer's clothing were her husband. More than 700 miles away in Olympia, Washington, Abby's brother, Lee Sansom, had been following the investigation. Aware of his sister's turbulent marriage, he also refused to accept that her death had been an accident.
I was very much surprised when a friend of my sister sent me a newspaper clipping indicating that the shooting had been declared an accident by the police. That was completely the last thing that I thought would happen.
Abby's brother traveled to the Palo Alto District Attorney's Office, hoping to convince them that this case demanded a closer look. Though he had no physical evidence, he believed he could establish a motive for murder. He said that just 2 weeks before Abby's death, the estate of their recently deceased parents had been settled. Abby's inheritance was $180,000. She confided to her brother that she planned to keep it in an account where James couldn't touch it. However, if Abby died before her divorce was finalized, the money would automatically go to James Niebauer, which is exactly how it was playing out. But ultimately, authorities weren't swayed. And Lee Sansom quickly realized that if he was going to find justice for his sister, he would have to come up with solid physical evidence on his own. As he struggled to find a way to expose his brother-in-law's crime, he received a letter from authorities in Palo Alto.
I got a letter back saying that they didn't really feel that there was any reason that the local prosecutor probably knew what they were doing, and that there was no reason for them to look further into it.
Unwilling to accept the official ruling, Sansom made a difficult decision. He quit his job as a computer programmer and began investing all of his time and money to finding justice for his sister.
Financially, I lost everything that I had put aside for my retirement and that I had inherited from my parents. And as I say, there were huge gaps of time in which I was waiting for some results. It was very difficult. Sounds like a good one.
8 years passed without a break. Then, Sansom learned of a survivors advocacy group called Citizens Against Homicide. They agreed to help him jumpstart the investigation. The group contacted the Palo Alto Police Department and persisted until authorities agreed to re-examine Abby's death. When homicide detective Michael Yore reviewed the files, he was surprised at what he found.
My first impression on this particular case was that there was a homicide that occurred. This was not an accident.
With Lee Sansom's help, Detective Yore, a firearms expert, retrieved the old shotgun and examined it for himself. It left him with more questions than answers.
How could you get a single shot shotgun, okay, where you have 14 pounds of pressure to cock the shotgun? How could you get something like that where you've taken the time to take the foregrip off, taken the time to take the stock off, unscrew all these parts, and then not notice that this is a single shot shotgun that's loaded and cocked?
The finding compelled detectives to reopen the case. They began by interviewing the couple's youngest son, who was living at home at the time of the shooting. He told police that just hours before his mother was killed, he and his father had decided to return home a day early from a skiing trip. When they entered the house, he said his father stopped suddenly, listening for a sign that Abby was there with another man. But Abby wasn't home. His father seemed agitated, and then suggested he go out and have fun that evening. son thought this was peculiar, since his dad rarely let him go out, even on weekends. He went and never saw his mother alive again. Detective Ure was convinced that James Niebauer had sent his son away for a reason. He didn't want any witnesses to the shooting. But until investigators could find a way to come up with solid physical evidence to prove murder, Abby's death would officially remain an accident. After 10 years, police in Palo Alto, California agreed to reopen the investigation into the death of 47-year-old Abby Niebauer, shot by her husband James as he worked to restore an antique shotgun. Though they now suspected she had been murdered, investigators lacked the physical evidence to prove it. Convinced that something had been overlooked years before, Detective Michael Ure examined the coroner's report. The medical examiner had stated that the powder burns on Abby's sweater were consistent with her reaching out toward the gun barrel when it fired. When Detective Ure reviewed the photos for himself, he came to a different conclusion. The powder burns, he noticed, were on the outside forearm area of the sweater.
That doesn't match up with somebody reaching out and being shot directly into the chest. So that's what initially caused me to sit back and say, how else could it have happened? Once again, on the 21st of
To find out, Detective Ure devised his own forensic experiment using the antique shotgun. With mannequins donated from a department store and white dress shirts from his own closet, the detective set out to replicate the powder burns on Abby's clothing using James's version of events as his starting point. But that scenario failed to reproduce the same patterns. Ure continued to adjust the position of the mannequin's arms and his firing distance. After several days of test firing, he was finally able to replicate the burns on Abby's clothing. At 11 inches away, the shotgun blast produced identical burn patterns. And the defensive position of the arms suggested that Abby Niebauer knew what was about to happen to her.
And now this changes the scenario from she was looking at the bright colors that were on the weapon itself, voluntarily having a shotgun placed at her heart and doing it with her consent, to her now having a shotgun placed at her heart and her in an Alfred Hitchcock terrified position.
An independent forensics authority confirmed Detective Ure's test results. And now, the Palo Alto District Attorney was convinced that James Niebauer had murdered his wife. James Niebauer, now 69 years old, was arrested at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport as he returned from a trip to Germany. He was extradited to California, where he stood trial for the murder of his wife. Police believe that James Niebauer recognized his marriage was over. And the only way to cash in on Abby's recent inheritance was to kill her before the divorce was finalized.
Abby, can you come here for a minute?
After sending his son out of the house, James loaded and cocked the old shotgun and waited patiently for his unsuspecting wife. As she stepped into the kitchen, he fired, killing her instantly. Later, he staged the scene to appear he'd been cleaning the weapon. In 1999, James Niebauer was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years in prison. For the victim's brother, Lee Sansom, it was the end of a long struggle for justice, but not the end of the mystery.
I still wonder why Cindy Barr could take my sister's life after being married to her for all those years, and do it not in an angry way, but in a carefully planned way. And I still wonder how he could do that.
Though some homicide investigations can linger for years without a break, justice has a long memory. And advancing forensic technology can heat up an otherwise cold case. Houston, Texas, July 25th, 1987. In the afternoon hours, a road crew working along a rural highway prepared to finish up their day's work. Without warning, a passing motorist suddenly opened fire. One of the workers was hit in the leg. A co-worker managed to get the pickup truck's license number as the vehicle sped away. The information was quickly called into the Harris County Sheriff's Office. Within a few hours, Detective Marcel Leon had traced the tag to a car dealership owned by a man named Michael Neal. Police went to the car lot to interview Neal about the shooting. But according to an employee there, a young woman named Tracy Jo Shine, Michael Neal wasn't around.
Is he here? Michael here?
Detectives asked her about his current whereabouts, but she was incoherent and seemed unable to answer any questions.
Tracy Jo appeared to have probably had a shot or had taken some type of a drug, and tried to get her to tell me where Michael Neal was, because that's who I was looking for.
The officers asked to look around. Near Tracy Jo, the detective found a bag containing a powdery substance.
Hey, detective, I think you need
In the back room, the deputy uncovered a makeshift lab used for manufacturing methamphetamine, a potent form of speed. Though Tracy Jo claimed to know nothing about that, she was placed under arrest. Bobby Neal, Michael Neal's brother and co-owner of the car dealership, was also arrested on drug charges. Now, with drug charges pending, Tracy Jo was willing to talk to police about Michael Neal. She said she and Michael were romantically involved. In fact, the two shared a house. Though she didn't know where he currently was, she told police that he was the man who had shot the road worker. She said that she and Michael Neal had gone out joyriding in his pickup. He was firing a handgun at random targets. He thought it would be fun to shoot the worker. Tracy Jo didn't know that he intended to actually hit them. She said she would be willing to testify against her boyfriend if police agreed to drop the drug charges against her. Until then, she refused to make an official statement. Tracy Jo was released on bail.
When she left that, she told me she would get back with me and help me with the case.
But more than a month went by without a word from the witness. Then, on September 9th, Tracy Jo's mother, Virginia Shine, came in to speak with police. She hadn't heard from her daughter in nearly 3 weeks. Tracy Jo Shine, the star witness in an attempted murder investigation, was now missing. Police in Harris Michael Neal, the prime suspect in a random drive-by shooting, left one road worker lucky to be alive. Though Neal's girlfriend, Tracy Jo Shine, had agreed to testify against him, she was now missing. Though the timing of her disappearance was suspicious, investigators had to consider that she had left town to avoid having to testify against her boyfriend. But then, Detective Marcel Dion received a call. A woman who wished to remain anonymous claimed to have information about a man who had murdered his girlfriend in their home.
Supposedly, the girl had been placed in a 55-gallon drum of muriatic acid and been dismembered just prior to that. The informant started relating to me the names involved, and she named Michael Neal and Tracy Jo Shine.
The informant heard rumors that the victim's remains had been transported to Michael Neal's car lot in a refrigerator after lying in his home for 3 days. Investigators obtained a warrant to search the premises of the car dealership. Though Michael Neal was not at work, Harris County authorities began searching the area. On the side of the building, technicians found an abandoned refrigerator. It was unplugged and wide open, as if it were being aired out. It appeared to have been recently cleaned, but as examiners soon learned, not thoroughly enough. Debris still clung to its surfaces, including what appeared to be a small fragment of flesh. Investigators collected the sample and sent it off to the lab for analysis. In 1987, DNA testing was in its infancy and required large samples. With such a small sample to work with, examiners were only able to conclude that the DNA extracted from the refrigerator was human and that it had come from a female. The process had consumed the entire sample, precluding any further testing. For investigators, the finding of female human tissue, however, supported the anonymous caller's statements that Tracy Jo Shine had been murdered. Looking to find additional evidence to corroborate the story, police searched Michael Neal's bedroom, where Tracy Jo's dead body had allegedly lain for 3 days. If Tracy Jo had been murdered there, police and forensic technicians could find no evidence to prove it. Michael Neal's whereabouts also remained a mystery. In November 1987, 4 months after Tracy Jo's disappearance, investigators got a break. Michael Neal had been located in San Antonio. He was in police custody for having shot a man in the face. Through his lawyer, Michael refused to make any statements about Tracy Jo Shine's whereabouts. Though investigators believed he was involved in her disappearance, they lacked physical evidence.
If you bring a case like this in front of a jury, and a jury says, well, what if we convict this guy and then Tracy Jo shows up? And it's very hard to, when somebody disappears, to assume that this person is dead.
The investigators would have to find another way to make their case. They interviewed dozens of inmates serving time with Michael Neal, hoping the suspect had bragged about the murder. But other than rumors, no one had any useful information. For months, detectives searched the surrounding area, hoping any sign of the missing woman would turn up. But the investigation into Tracy Jo Shine's disappearance turned cold. and it would remain that way for the next 12 years. By 1999, Harris County detectives had formed a cold case squad to deal with a growing number of unsolved crimes. While assessing old files, they came across Tracy Jo Shine's case report. They agreed her disappearance demanded a closer look. And though more than a decade had gone by, Detective Roger Wedgeworth believed the passage of time could work to his benefit.
People get divorced. Wives are more likely to talk about an ex-husband than they are to talk about a present husband. People aren't threatened by individuals anymore. They could be incarcerated, something like that. So time helps us that way.
One of the people mellowed by time was Michael Neal's brother, Bobby, who had been imprisoned 12 years earlier for manufacturing methamphetamine. His parole hearing was coming up, and now he was willing to tell what he knew. Bobby said that about the time Tracy Jo disappeared, he'd gone over to his brother's house. He found Michael in the garage, trying to load a taped-up refrigerator into his pickup truck.
Where do you want to put it? In the truck.
The place reeked, and Michael was burning insects to cover the smell. Bobby helped his brother put the fridge on the truck. Then they drove it to the car dealership and unloaded it.
What happened to her?
Bobby said he had no idea what was inside. Though he was being cooperative, investigators felt he had not told them everything.
We felt that Bobby had seen her body in the refrigerator, and we wanted him to tell us. And we felt that because he was incarcerated at that time, that we could possibly pressure him to tell the truth.
But the suspect's brother wasn't talking. Still, the information he provided focused the investigation once again on the refrigerator. Unfortunately, Detective Marcel Dion, who had worked the case 12 years earlier, had made certain that the evidence remained in police custody.
I don't know how many times everyone tried to get me to release that refrigerator so that they could get rid of it out of our property room. And I wouldn't let it go because I knew that was the only real piece of evidence that we had.
After dismantling the appliance, technicians went to work searching for evidence. They found and collected several biological samples that had gone previously undetected. Though investigators had no known samples from Tracy Jo to compare it to, the evidence was sent to GeneScreen, a DNA testing laboratory that opened in the year after Tracy Jo disappeared. But the police property room where the refrigerator had sat for 12 years was not climate controlled. And senior forensic scientist William Watson was not optimistic.
I did not believe that there was a good chance of generating a DNA profile from the samples that they had, just because of the condition that they were in and the environment that they had been in.
And in fact, the samples were too degraded for conventional DNA testing. However, a new procedure was being developed. The technique, called mitochondrial DNA sequencing, looks at a specific strand of DNA in the cell nucleus which passed unchanged from mother to child. Potentially, examiners could determine if the latest evidence recovered from the refrigerator had come from the biological child of Virginia Shine.
It was the perfect type of case for this sort of testing because every other type of testing had been exhausted. And we were up against the wall. There was really nothing that we could say about the samples that were found inside the refrigerator, except that back in 1987, they determined that they were from a human, and that was it. So if we didn't get a profile of mitochondrial DNA, we weren't going to have anything at all.
The procedure was a success. Examiners then compared the profile generated from the refrigerator to those of Tracy Joe's mother, Virginia Shine. The results were a match.
Never look at the overall
In a court of law, the tiny samples were enough to constitute the victim's deceased body. After 12 years of waiting, advanced forensic technology had provided investigators with proof that Tracy Joe Shine had been murdered. On January 1st, 2000, Michael Neal, imprisoned on unrelated charges, was confronted with the evidence that confirmed Tracy Joe's body had been in his refrigerator. Faced with the death penalty, he confessed to the murder. He said that after learning that Tracy Joe was cooperating with police in the road worker shooting investigation, his anger turned deadly, and he strangled her to death. 3 days later, he cut up her body, placed it into the refrigerator, and then disposed of the remains. After pleading guilty, Michael Neal was sentenced to 45 years in prison for first-degree murder. When tackling a crime, investigators face two scenarios: a lack of clues to fit the suspect, or a lack of suspects to fit the clues. Fort Collins, Colorado, August 29, 1989. In the early afternoon hours, a real estate agent was showing prospective buyers a home in a desirable neighborhood. As they made their way into the master bedroom, they stumbled upon a gruesome find. The current homeowner, 39-year-old Sarah Dean, lay dead on the floor. After receiving the frantic 911 call, officers from the Fort Collins Police Department rushed to the scene. There, in the second-floor bedroom, they found the victim with a telephone cord wrapped tightly around her neck. Sarah Dean had also been sexually assaulted. A spilled cup of water found near her body suggested she had been taken by surprise. Police searched the nearby bathroom. In the bathtub, they located debris that had been tracked in from the outside. The window was unlocked. For investigators, this marked the killer's likely entry point. Looking to uncover additional evidence, crime scene technicians applied a laser wand throughout the area, which causes the proteins found in bodily fluids to fluoresce. The laser exposed several stains. The samples were collected and preserved as evidence. As police processed the outside of the house, they located and collected a palm print on the locked kitchen window. But there was no telling when it might have been left there, or by whom. No ladder marks or any other signs of a forced entry were found. At autopsy, the medical examiner confirmed that Sarah Dean had been brutally beaten before being sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. The medical examiner collected additional biological evidence, and blood typing analysis confirmed that it matched all of the samples collected from the crime scene. It had all originated from one individual. Police turned to the recovered palm print to tell them who that was. Though the lift had provided a clear image of the palm print, a search through databases containing fingerprint records turned up no matches. until investigators could find a way to tie all of the evidence to a suspect, Sarah Dean's killer would remain a free man. Police in Fort Collins, Colorado struggled to solve the brutal rape and murder of 39-year-old Sarah Dean. And though they had collected incriminating physical evidence at the crime scene, they had no solid suspects to link it to. Using photographs taken at the scene, investigators worked to develop a profile of Sarah's killer. To reach the unlocked second-floor bathroom window, the suspect had to climb a fence, grab the gutter pipe, and then swing onto the roof. For investigators, that suggested that the perpetrator was young and agile, most likely a teenager. With an overwhelming amount of physical evidence to prove murder, Lieutenant Jim Broderick needed to find a way to identify the suspect.
I guess there was kind of a sense of confidence the whole time we were working it, is that we were finding evidence of the intruder. It was just a matter of identifying who the intruder was.
Lieutenant Broderick ran the victim's name through the law enforcement database. Sarah Dean's name had recently been entered into the system. She had filed a police report 10 days before she was murdered. According to the reports, Sarah called police after returning home late one night to discover that her home had been robbed. Among the items stolen were a tape player, a red and blue gin bag, 2 bottles of wine, and several pairs of black underwear. But the responding officers had found no signs of forced entry and no clues to the robber's identity. That investigation quickly went cold. For investigators, the fetish aspects of the robbery and the sexual nature of the homicide made it easy to connect the two crimes. Lieutenant Broderick speculated that the robbery might have been a sort of dress rehearsal for the young suspect.
He knew the general layout of the house, may have even known, based on the amount of time that he spent in the house, that on the prior occasion, 10 days earlier, that certain windows aren't locked.
Even though the evidence suggested the crime of a stranger, investigators couldn't yet eliminate the possibility that the killer was someone she knew. Police interviewed Sarah Dean's co-workers, friends, and acquaintances, starting with her fiancé. He told police that he and Sarah had recently become engaged and planned to marry in a few months. They were excited about their future together. Sarah was in the process of selling her home, so they could purchase a new one together. He had no idea who could have done this to Sarah. Before releasing the fiancé, police collected blood samples. Serological tests later confirmed he was not the killer. Over the next several months, hundreds of local residents, including known sex offenders, were brought in for questioning. All were asked to submit blood samples.
I'll bet you there was 300 to 400 people that actually had blood samples drawn from and compared to the evidence at the scene, but no one was being matched up.
The search for Sarah Dean's killer was turning up nothing. Then, in September 1989, a month after the homicide, Fort Collins police uncovered a clue. The car that had recently been reported stolen was found abandoned along the side of the road. Inside, the officer collected a baseball cap with the initials DT Jr. written on the brim. had stolen the car, burglary detectives contacted area high schools and looked for students with those initials. They found one. 16-year-old Douglas Thames Jr. was brought in for questioning. When asked about the hat, he claimed that he had lent it to some friends of his a few weeks earlier and never got it back. With his mother present, Thames denied stealing the car. Within a few hours, police had located the two young men. They not only admitted stealing the car, they also confessed to being part of a gang responsible for robbing a few area homes. They showed police where they kept their stolen property. Among the electronics and other goods, police found a red and blue gym bag, like the one reported stolen by Sarah Dean 10 days before her murder. Officers confronted the teenagers with the evidence linking them to the homicide. But the boys denied any knowledge of it. And they refused to divulge the names of other teenagers involved in the robberies. Police collected blood samples and palm prints, but none matched the evidence recovered from the crime scene. For investigators, the setback was frustrating.
Over the course of the next 4 to 5 years, there's just nothing coming in. I mean, there's good leads based on people arrested in other jurisdictions for similar crimes, but you do the serological testing, and it just doesn't match up with our crime scene.
6 years after Sarah Dean was found brutally murdered in her home, police were no closer to finding her killer. By 1995, 6 years had passed since 39-year-old Sarah Dean was found sexually assaulted and murdered in her Fort Collins, Colorado home. Though police had collected an overwhelming amount of physical evidence from the crime scene, they struggled to link it to a suspect. The case had ground to a halt. But in July of 1995, all of that changed. A heating technician working on a furnace in a rented house made a strange discovery. As he worked to fix a clogged air duct, he found several pairs of women's underwear stuffed inside. Recalling the details of the Sarah Dean robbery and homicide, he called police. Lieutenant Broderick responded to the call, hopeful that this could be the break that eluded authorities for years.
Up inside there? Yeah.
When he saw the underwear, he realized they matched the description of those that had been reported stolen by Sarah Dean 10 days before her murder. The detective collected the items and forwarded them to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. There, Laboratory Agent Examiner Ted DeValis located and extracted biological evidence from several of the items. Even though the samples had sat for 6 years in a furnace air duct, Agent DeValis was confident that new DNA technology would allow him to obtain valuable evidence.
I would have been concerned of doing the old ABO typing and some of the protein markers, which are more subject to degradation. DNA is very stable, and again, what we do is we always go ahead and try to develop a DNA profile to see if we can be successful or not.
DeValis was able to develop a genetic profile of the suspect from the evidence recovered from the underwear. When that was compared to the biological evidence recovered from the Sarah Dean crime scene, DeValis concluded that all of the samples in this case had originated from one individual. Having established a physical link between the crime scene and the rented house. Investigators raced to find out who had lived there at the time of the murder. Fortunately, the landlord kept meticulous records. He told police that in August of 1989, the house was rented to a family who had a few teenage boys. One was named Douglas Thames Jr., the teenager who had provided investigators with information 6 years earlier. A check of statewide records revealed that Douglas Thames Jr., now 22 years old, lived several hundred miles away in Grand Junction, Colorado. Armed with a court order to obtain blood samples and fingerprints from Douglas Thames Jr., Detective Broderick headed for Grand Junction. With Thames at his job site, where he worked as a roofer. He was taken in for questioning. After several hours, Thames remained uncooperative with police. All right, Douglas. Convinced he was hiding something, investigators took handprints and collected blood samples before releasing the suspect. After developing a DNA profile from Douglas Thames Jr.'s known blood samples, Agent DeValis compared it to the evidence found at the crime scene and on the underwear recovered from the furnace. All of the samples matched. Fort Collins police had found Sarah Dean's killer. Police returned to Grand Junction, this time with an arrest warrant. You have the right to talk to a lawyer. Douglas Thames Jr. was taken into custody and charged with the 1989 murder of Sarah Dean. Police believe that 10 days after breaking into Sarah Dean's house, the 16-year-old returned, slipping in through the open second-floor bathroom window. Thames caught his victim completely off guard. Sarah Dean probably never knew what hit her. For the crime of first-degree murder, Douglas Thames Jr. was sentenced to life. When a homicide investigation goes unsolved, some killers feel safe to put their deeds behind them. Armed with patience and the latest forensic technology, investigators can heat up a cold case and find justice for the unforgotten.
In Alabama, a series of deadly assaults shocks the community and frustrates police. All the killers leave behind are the dead and fleeting images of surveillance videotape. Local police and federal agents follow the killer's trail up and down the eastern seaboard. The shadowy fugitives keep running, but the FBI will not give up the chase.
Surveillance video is often the most precise witness to a crime. Its images can speak for victims when they are unable. After 3 brutal murders were caught on tape in Alabama, the suspects fled the area. They had an arsenal of stolen weapons and swore they wouldn't be taken alive. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Racing across several states, the fugitives tried to elude the FBI and agents hope to capture them without more bloodshed.
In the 1990s, Birmingham, Alabama saw a drop in both its population and its crime rate.